3 squad cars screamed up my dirt road at 7 a.m., gravel pinging off fenders, pine needles crunching under boots as officers fanned out like I'd robbed a bank instead of poured coffee. Delilah Thornfield, designer heels punching divots into my driveway, jabbed her manicured finger at me in my grandfather's rocking chair and commanded, "Officer, arrest him. He's illegally occupying HOA property." The sheriff wouldn't meet my eyes at first. Small town, he knows me. And the diesel haze couldn't hide Delilah's panic sweat perfume when I reached into my flannel, unfolded a yellowed sheet and said, "Sheriff, you might want to see this." His jaw fell open at the seal. The original 1890s land grant, the Caldwell homestead, every acre beneath her expensive shoes legally mine long before her HOA existed. The deputy glanced at Delilah's Tesla, then back at me like he'd watched. The ground move. What would you do if someone tried to evict you from your own land? Drop your craziest HOA nightmare below and tell me where you're watching from. I'm Rex Caldwell, third-generation logger and a 20-year oil rig hand who saved every penny and came back to the 40 acres my great-grandfather built into a cabin that smells like cedar and history. Creek runs crystal clear. The dock flexes like old bones when you step on it, and summers sound like wind in lodge poles and kids learning to skip rocks. While I was in Alaska dodging polar bears and making bank, city developers decided my quiet valley needed a luxury facelift. They carved Alpine Vista estates into the hills, gated entries, $800,000 mountain lifestyle homes, and a newsletter that reads like a corporate HR manual. Enter Delilah, mid-40s, former corporate lawyer, a white Tesla polished to a mirror, and an HOA presidency she wields like a scepter. She introduced herself in a cream suit and an attitude that said I was lucky to breathe her air. "Mr. Caldwell, your property sits in the middle of our community, which means you're subject to our covenants." She handed me a certified letter, demanding $25,000 in mandatory improvements. New siding, approved paint, professional landscaping, 30 days or $500 daily fines. "Ma'am, I'm not part of your HOA," I said, laying out my grandfather's survey, yellowed and legal. "That paperwork is irrelevant in today's legal environment," she sniffed. "You'll comply, or we'll ensure you do." Her heels clicked off my porch like a countdown. That night, with a mason jar of my grandfather's moonshine and my bloodhound, General Patton, resting his head on my knee, I watched the glow from Alpine Vista glitz the valley and knew I wasn't dealing with standards. I was dealing with a land grab in a fitted blazer. Here's what she didn't understand. My family didn't just build this cabin. We helped stitch the county together, deed by deed, handshake by handshake. Some papers go quiet in a drawer for a century until the day someone calls your heritage non-compliant, and then those papers wake up like dynamite. First, though, I had to survive her opening barrage, inspectors, surveys, and a social smear campaign that would make a campaign operative blush. You can push a mountain man, but if you push him on his land, you'd better have read more than your HOA handbook. 3 mornings after her porch performance, a convoy announced itself with starch and clipboards, county code enforcement, 3 inspectors who looked apologetic before we'd said hello. "Mr. Caldwell, we've received multiple complaints about possible violations." Behind them sat Delilah in her climate-controlled command pod, sunglasses reflecting my cabin like a crime scene. My grandfather taught me not to make enemies of working men sent by a paper tyrant, so I poured coffee, passed homemade jerky, and let them do their jobs while I set the table with law. Turns out there's a name for cabins like mine. Legally. Established non-conforming use. Translation. It was here first, so new rules don't apply. I'd spent hours with the county clerk learning that grandfather clauses protect old structures from modern requirements. The senior inspector ran a hand over a hand-hewn beam and asked when the place was built. I spread the documentation like a royal flush. 1890 building permits, survey maps, precedent. They spent 2 hours crawling rafters and testing well, water, admiring the 1995 electrical update and my 1962 septic that still runs like a mule. When the lead guy finally spoke, he grinned like he'd been waiting to say it. "Mr. Caldwell, you're in full compliance, better than most new builds." Through the kitchen window, I watched him deliver the news to Delilah, her jaw clenched hard enough to crack a veneer. She pivoted to petty warfare. That afternoon, her Tesla parked sideways across my driveway. "Oh, Rex, I was just checking our boundaries. This strip is HOA common space per our newest survey." The road my family's wheels wore smooth since 1923 wasn't a suggestion. "Ma'am, you're blocking a century-old legal right-of-way." "Feel free to call the sheriff," she purred. She'd commissioned a fresh survey that conveniently shifted lines to swallow my access. The white specter reappeared like a ghost all week, blocking the well truck, inspecting my firewood stacks, photographing General Patton for unsanctioned pet waste. She even fed a story to the local paper about a concerned citizen, defending property values from a holdout degrading the aesthetic. Some Alpine Vista neighbor swallowed it whole. $800,000 investments don't like friction. But the old mountain families smelled a hustle and started knocking on my door with casseroles, hammers, and stories. Jake from the hardware store was battling bogus noise complaints. Nurse Sarah Avery's vegetable garden was non-conforming. Suddenly our valley had a line down the middle. Delilah's staged suburb versus people tired of being policed by Pinterest. General Patton became our mascot, waddling over to autograph her pristine walls at sunrise as if to say some things in this valley answer to older standards than newsletters. Then she hired a private investigator in a suit that screamed, "Budget." He fished for dirt about Alaska, taxes, trouble. Behind him, Delilah watched like a director waiting for a good take. 2 days later, legal papers landed. A lawsuit for boundary disputes, $50,000 in fees, and 3 years of back HOA assessments. Lawfare by volume. So I went to see Ephraim Jacobs, 78, the surveyor who's mapped half of Montana. His office smelled like pipe tobacco, his walls like art. "Son, I surveyed this land for your granddad in 72, he said, pulling a folder that felt heavier than paper. He spread an 1890s territorial survey and traced lines that made my hands go cold. The original Caldwell homestead mapped nearly 400 acres, including half of Alpine Vista. Your family retained mineral and water rights when they sold. Standard practice back then. I left with a new understanding. Delilah knew surface, law. She'd forgotten the ground beneath her feet had an owner, too. And that owner had my name. The clerk's office smelled like old leather and time when Margaret Peterson pulled a ledger from a shelf and said, "Rex, honey, you'll want to sit." Her reading glasses slid down like an owl's beak as she opened to a page ribboned in history. There, in my great-grandfather Josiah's neat hand, was a territorial land grant that reset the map in my head. When Montana achieved statehood, he'd been granted not 40 or 400 acres, but the entire Pineville County section. 12,000 acres, payment for service as territorial land commissioner. "You didn't lose it," Margaret said when I asked how we'd lost a county. "Over the decades, your family sold parcels. But look at the clauses. Retained mineral rights, water rights, subsurface use, on every sale. According to these, you own the water table under Alpine Vista's lawns, the minerals under the courthouse, the rights beneath kids' bedrooms and Delilah's heated pool." I sat with the weight and the temptation. One filing could turn off Alpine Vista's taps, crater values, bankrupt families. Power misused is just revenge with paperwork. My grandfather's voice sounded like wind in pines. The difference between a good man and a great man is what he does when nobody's watching and everybody's counting on him. I called 3 people who didn't think win meant ruin. Sarah Blackwood, an environmental lawyer who specializes in community land trusts, answered on the first ring. "What you're describing is a perfect CLT candidate. Separate land ownership from homes. Residents own their houses. The community owns the land. Governance is democratic, not dictatorial." She drove up from Missoula with Dr. Ruby Sterling, a conservation biologist who nearly jumped at the sight of my creek. "Rex, you've got threatened habitat, bog lemmings, grizzly corridors, old growth. This qualifies for federal protection." Harold Finch, our banker of 40 years, spread amortizations and history on my table. There are over 250 community land trusts nationwide: Burlington, Champlain, San Francisco. CLTs preserve affordability and stabilize values. If you anchor it with your water mineral rights, you can fund maintenance and trails for generations. We sketched a plan that felt like my great-grandfather was looking over our shoulders. The Pineville County Conservation Trust would hold the land. Residents keep their homes. 8,000 acres preserved as protected wilderness. 4,000 zoned for sustainable living. Anti-displacement baked in. Democratic bylaws. No more queen bees in white blazers. Federal conservation grants could fund trails, an environmental learning center, wildlife research. Harold's numbers showed 47 permanent jobs. In guiding, education, and maintenance, real work for locals. Sarah drafted the legal skeleton. Ruby mapped habitat with GPS and Glee. Harold tuned the financing so nobody got crushed. We'd need 75% approval from residents. We'd need Delilah's war to teach the valley that cooperation beats coercion. Late nights smelled like wood smoke and coffee. The dog snored under Sarah's chair. Ruby pinned migration routes on a map. Harold calculated buy-in rates in lockboxes. I practiced explaining how subsurface rights that could be used like a hammer would instead be used like a foundation. My favorite line in Sarah's deck was simple. Replace HOA dictatorship with community democracy. All that remained was postponing my nuclear option while Delilah tried hers, and not losing my temper when she turned my life into a surveillance project wrapped in legal paper. Delilah smelled a shift and doubled down with theater. She organized community safety patrols to stake out my driveway, convinced 3 board members to file a restraining order based on twisted quotes, and lodged a state environmental complaint alleging my cabin polluted groundwater. The inspector arrived unannounced, took soil and water samples while Delilah held court across the road, narrating my threats to an anxious cluster. The results came back clean enough to bottle. Your spring is filtering water for the valley, the inspector said, barely hiding his opinion of the complainant. Meanwhile, her board, sick of legal bills and stress, started whispering about removal. Then Jake Morrison tore up my drive with news red as his face. She tried to bribe Commissioner Hicks, offered 50 grand if he'd condemn your cabin. Hicks called the sheriff on the spot. The FBI Public Corruption Unit perked up. When agents looked into the outside HOA firm she'd hired, Mountain Property Solutions, they found a racketeering investigation already in progress in 3 states. Delilah had overplayed so spectacularly, it was like she'd invited the feds to our barbecue. She scheduled her emergency safety meeting with media in tow to star in her final act. I scheduled something else for the exact same room. The Conservation Trust presentation with county commissioners, federal wildlife agents, and Sarah's legal brief. The community center looked like an election night war room. Standing room. Only cameras rimmed the walls, sheriff by the exits, 2 understated suits from Billings watching. Delilah opened like a prosecutor, photos of my cabin, charts of declining values, a timeline of my supposed antisocial behavior, and, finally, the flourish. Mr. Caldwell must be condemned for public safety. The applause was polite and thin in the corners. Commissioner Hicks gave me the mic. I walked up in my best flannel, opened one manila folder, and watched the room lean forward. Before we debate standards, let's establish ownership. I, guys, held up the 1889 territorial grant. This document created the Caldwell homestead, not 40 acres, but the entire Pineville section, 12,000 acres. Every deed in Alpine Vista contains retained mineral and water rights. If I chose, I could shut off your taps tomorrow. The room made that sound a crowd makes when it realizes the rules are different than it thought. Delilah snapped upright. Impossible. I researched every deed. You researched the surface, ma'am. You missed what's beneath it. But I'm not here for punishment. I'm here for a solution. I introduced Sarah, Ruby, and Harold. Sarah laid out the trust. Democratic, transparent, protective. Ruby described the endangered habitat. Harold showed stable values without speculation or tyranny. The old families stood first, and then the applause swept the room like a wind through trees. That's when a badge joined us at the podium. Miss Thornfield, an agent said, you're under arrest for attempted bribery of a public official. The cameras got everything. The cuffs, the stunned mouth, the HOA management suits edging toward the side door like raccoons caught at the garbage can. In 30 minutes, the valley learned 2 truths. My family owned the legal foundation, and I refused to weaponize it. Instead, I offered everyone a way out that protected homes, the land, and our sanity. Turns out people like freedom more than fines. 30 days later, our valley gathered at my cabin for what the paper called the Great Decision Barbecue. Hickory smoke drifted through Gold Larch, kids played tag among split rounds, and neighbors lined up to drop ballots into a plywood box Jake built behind the store. Sheriff Martinez tallied with 2 volunteers, and when he looked up smiling, I felt my grandfather in the wind. 87% for the Pineville County Conservation Trust. Even some Alpine Vista folks who'd cheered Delilah voted yes, because they'd seen what unchecked standards do to a soul. By unanimous consent, they made me the trust's first president. My first act was building a council with seats reserved for every neighborhood and voice, codified so no blazer could ever crown herself queen again. Within a year, the transformation was visible from the ridge. 8,000 acres enrolled in conservation. A modest environmental center teaching kids how to read tracks in snow. Trailheads with maps Ruby designed. 47 permanent jobs across guiding, education, hospitality, and maintenance. Property values stabilized while monthly housing costs dropped for buy-in families. Quarterly open book audits streamed live. The annual Pineville Freedom Festival became our signature weekend. Bluegrass echoing off granite, crafts, ranger, talks, scholarship jars that sent 12 mountain kids to college last year. The legal community noticed. Scholars from Harvard, Stanford, and Montana wrote case studies. Someone called it the Caldwell Doctrine, using inherited subsurface rights for community benefit instead of personal leverage. Sarah opened a nonprofit to help other towns form trusts. Ruby's team published habitat data that won us federal support. Harold finally smiled on a Tuesday and said, "Son, this is the best loan I never made." Delilah pled down on the bribery charge, law license gone, 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and her hired enforcers at Mountain Property Solutions collapsed under federal racketeering cases elsewhere. Her Alpine Vista mansion sold at a loss to a young teacher's family who planted tomatoes in the front yard, because that's what victory looks like in a place that remembers what food tastes like. 6 months after the vote, a Texas rancher wrote me about an HOA built like a trap around his land. General Patton's ears twitched as I read. "Seems like tyranny spreads faster than wildfire, old boy," I told him. "Maybe we can share what we learned. That's the thing about real wins. They scale because they're built on fairness, not fear." Most evenings I sit on the porch my great-grandfather notched, watching chimney smoke rise in a valley that chose cooperation over coercion. The pine whisper is different now, lighter. The dog snores, retired from marking Teslas, and kids on the trail wave like they know this place loves them back. The sweetest victory wasn't stopping someone. It was lifting everyone. Proving quiet competence outlasts loud aggression. That documents older than your accuser can be used like a bridge instead of a cudgel. And that democracy beats dictatorship, whether your dictator wears a robe, a badge, or a white blazer. Share your worst HOA nightmare in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe if you want more true stories where entitled gatekeepers meet the only standards that matter: law, community, and basic decency. We've got more valleys to fix.